This is heartbreaking to think of how many of our kids are being exposed to biotoxins from water damaged schools. My family had actually moved from the suburbs to a little homestead, and our kids were selling kale and organic eggs at the farmer's market. It was really, really sweet. But our whole family started getting really, really sick. I began having suicidal thoughts, like out of the blue, really strange desires to just walk in the woods and not come back. Meanwhile, my son started feeling really poorly and he started having gut issues, severe anxiety, insomnia, dizziness, chest pain, all kinds of stuff. So we took him to his pediatrician and she said, I don't know if it's radon or lead paint or some kind of chemical or mold, something, I think something's bothering his whole body and it's probably in there. So we went through a battery of tests on that school and it turns out the toxic black mold was really high.
Welcome back to the podcast. Diving right in, I want you to meet Jenny Johnson. And she's going to share with us her story and how she transitioned or how she still integrates physical therapy and health coaching with a unique, although I would imagine, growing niche. So, welcome, Jenny.
Thank you. It's great to be here and I look forward to connecting with you through your show.
Yeah. So let's start off with your story. Most of us in functional medicine, integrative health, I think there's interesting right now in there's a sway between integrative health and conventional health. And I'm hoping for, and I am actually seeing more collaboration, more true integration.
Yeah.
But let's start with your story of your career because so many of our listeners are health and wellness professionals themselves. And it can be so inspiring to hear your journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll try to spare your audience from the long version because I know we all have a short version and a long version of our story. But I graduated with a master's degree in physical therapy in 2000, right at the turn of the century. And I got into pediatrics right away. I just loved working with babies and with kids in schools. And I did that for 16 years, I guess. When I had babies of my own, I kind of went part-time, but I loved it. And one of the interesting things that I did not connect at all during these 16 years is I would come home on the days that I would go to certain homes where babies lived and even certain schools, and I would just be so tired. And at the time, I thought it was just the nature of the work, chasing little kids and you're putting yourself out there and you're driving around and using your brain and, it just being a professional all day long. And then you come home and you're kind of just exhausted. But I was more than that. I would crawl into bed at the end of the day after being in certain buildings. And again, I didn't really put it together. I just know that I was tired all the time. But I continued to do this for 16 years. And at the
So you
16
always worked in like a home health kind of setting or direct to the
Yep.
client. Mhm.
Yep. I was doing early intervention, birth to 3 babies, so working in their homes, and you just go where you're sent, right? And it might be a trailer or, any kind of home, and I didn't really think anything of it at the time, and then also working in schools, so itinerant, going from school to school, working with school kids, and helping to accommodate for their needs in the school system. Um, Little did I know at that time that a lot of schools are water damaged. And this is heartbreaking to think of how many of our kids are being exposed to biotoxins from water damaged schools, water damaged buildings. I didn't know it at the time. I know it now. I don't get tired like that anymore. I have figured out the root cause for myself. But back to the story of the 16-year mark, what was happening at that 16-year mark is my family had actually moved from the suburbs to a little homestead. We bought some land in the woods and we kind of added on to this little cabin that was there. And we built out this really beautiful organic farmstead. And our kids were selling kale and organic eggs at the farmer's market. It was really, really sweet. We were homeschooling part time and then I was doing PT part time. But our whole family started getting really, really sick. And so that fatigue that I was feeling on the days that I worked turned into just chronic fatigue that I felt often. a lot of insomnia, a lot of anxiety, odd mental health stuff that I'd never felt before. My friends in college always called me sunshine because I was just that kind of annoying, always happy, just sunny disposition. I completely lost that, and it was all of a sudden kind of working on this farmstead and living in this little cabin, and I began having suicidal thoughts, like, out of the blue, really strange desires to just walk in the woods and not come back. Meanwhile, my son, I was feeling poorly enough, and so was my husband, interestingly, that we had to put our kids into a little part-time school, stop homeschooling them, and my son started feeling really poorly, and he started having gut issues, severe anxiety, insomnia, dizziness, chest pain, all kinds of stuff. And, as a pediatric physical therapist, I knew something. I'm not a doctor, but I was trying to figure out this seems multi systemic, like an allergy, or maybe it's a food, or it doesn't just seem like a cold or a flu kind of thing. So we started really with him because his symptoms were the worst. And we took him to his pediatrician. And she said, "When did his symptoms start?" And I said, "Well, on the first day of school at this little building, the school was meeting at kind of a defunct church that was undergoing renovations." And she said, "I know that building. That building has so much going on with it. I don't know if it's radon or lead paint or some kind of chemical or mold, something. I think something's bothering his whole body, and it's probably in there." So we went through a battery of tests on that school, and it turns out the toxic black mold was really high. This led us down kind of a rabbit hole. We tested our home because I was like, "Well, why am I sick too if, that's the school?" Well, it turns out our home had some issues too. Again, won't get into the long details of the story, but our whole family was basically being poisoned by biotoxins. And this led us to functional medicine because a lot of allopathic doctors, haven't been trained in this kind of thing. And there were some more functional medicine doctors that had. And at the time, they were most of them trained by Dr. Richie Shoemaker, who was really the first clinician to kind of coin the term biotoxin illness and to kind of piggyback on the idea of sick building syndrome. So we went down the path with him of testing our whole family and testing our home and figuring out what we needed to do. And the combination of the Shoemaker protocol to basically get out of the exposures that we were in, and then to do some detoxing to get rid of those biotoxins that we had accumulated and that our bodies weren't able to detox well. The addition of functional medicine on top of that is what brought me and my family not just to 100%, but actually to like 150%. So I got really curious about things that I didn't learn about in physical therapy school back in, when I graduated in 2000. I wasn't really taught the importance of nutrition and sleep and stress management and clean air, the connection between like lifestyle and environment and mindset with our physical symptoms, our physiology. My program didn't teach me. And I'm sure that there are a lot of other clinicians who really didn't get that instruction, especially if we went to school, in the previous century. So I dug into functional medicine, and it just made so much sense for me, for my family. And now I am a functional medicine health coach, and I still wear my physical therapy hat. And I am serving folks who also have environmental biotoxin exposures, trying to kind of combine the detox with the clean living and with the functional medicine that was so meaningful to my family.
Yeah. So the biotoxin that you were dealing with was essentially mold toxins, correct? Or were there others?
Yeah, well, we know now it's more than mold. But primarily most people think of it as mold, but when a building has been water damaged, there are lots of different microbes and byproducts that get produced. It can be bacterial, it can be volatile organic compounds like gases, degrading building materials that just off gas different things depending on what kind of paints were used. And then mold and microbial VOCs and mycotoxins and even the cell wall of a mold spore, when it's broken, there are beta glucans inside. There are inflammatory components inside the cell wall that may not be a toxin, like a mycotoxin, but are very inflammatory and can lead to this condition, chronic inflammatory response syndrome, where we're just exposed to the toxic soup of things that can be in our air when there's water damage.
Yeah, and so it's essentially a combination of PFAS, other chemicals, mycotoxins, bacteria, just a whole mess. And
Yeah,
now, but
pretty much.
here's the challenge. When I looked at your work, and when I work with a lot of patients with MCAS related to endometriosis or long COVID or other, post viral conditions, and I wonder what the difference is between chronic inflammatory response syndrome, CIRS, as we call it, or CIRS, or MCAS, mast cell activation syndrome. Essentially, it's like two sides of the same coin, right?
Yeah, very similar. I mean, they're both disorganized immune reactions to things, right? They're both signs that our immune system is upset and not responding as we want it to. And it's a pro. They're both pro-inflammatory states that can have very similar presentations. A lot of people that I come across with MCAS would say they are in exposure, meaning they know they have some mold in their house and they felt like that came first and they didn't address it maybe as early as they should have. And MCAS is like an additional layer of an angry or disorganized immune system that ensued. And it's not always mold, but like maybe it started with endometriosis or a food sensitivity or even a trauma, something that maybe wasn't organized and dealt with as it should have been. And then it's like that extra layer of MCAS. A lot of my clients, we need to address that first, kind of get the immune system at least organized a little bit before people can even tolerate binders or, medical therapy to remove toxins from their body. But they are very similar presentations, and there's a lot of crossover there.
Well, and I think essentially they're both an issue where, like Sears, you're dealing with the environment is the trigger, if you will, potentially of MCAS or any other presentation. So, or any other immune dysregulation, I guess. So, Sears, you're saying, okay, the environment is the clear trigger. And I think MCAS is the result of that, related to it could also be a viral trigger, it could be a trauma trigger, it could be, and usually it's multiple of these triggers over time, like an underlying genetic predisposition, say you're hypermobile, or you have EDS, or you have endometriosis or other sort of genetic predisposition, then you're like fine for the first X number of years, no matter what. And then you start your period, or then your high school has mold, or then you move into a new house that has mold or lead or some other toxin. So over time, I think if we look at these timelines, people just are like hit a point where their genetic vulnerability makes it hard for them to tolerate that environmental stress. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, I would so agree. And you see a lot of the stacking, the layering over time when we just can't handle it anymore. It becomes too much.
And I think it's so interesting that in your family, your whole family sort of presented at the same time. Do you find that normally? Because I often see that, like, the husband, like, there's always one person who's like, I'm fine.
Yeah. And it's often so spouses are more likely to have different genetics than like one of the parents and the kids. So I do often see like mom and son or dad and daughter or kids, but less often the husband and wife because they might not have the same genetics. But with CIRS, about 24% of the population actually has susceptible genetics for this condition, meaning we don't recognize, well, once the genes are upregulated, so we may be born and they are in their normal position, they're off. Some kind of trigger upregulates them, and it could be another illness, it could be COVID, it could be just a trauma, it could be a really big mold exposure. Something upregulates this genetic susceptibility, and then we are no longer able to create antibodies to biotoxins that we inhale. And so we're inhaling maybe the same biotoxins that we have been all of our life, but all of a sudden we can't detox them the way that we always have. Our body's not recognizing them as foreign, or at least our adaptive immune system isn't creating the antibodies. Our innate immune system, the pump out inflammation at anything foreign type immune system, does recognize them as foreign, and just that's where the chronic inflammatory response ensues. But 24% of the population, so there's a chance, both like mom and dad have it. And that's what happened with my husband and I. We actually both have the most, I hate this term, but the dreaded genes, like the kind of the most susceptible, if you
Yeah.
will.
Great,
So we
great. Yeah.
both happen to be in that 2%. And so, our kids were as well. So they were doubles, and so our whole family was in this, highly susceptible camp. Interestingly, my daughter was actually the one who she was only 8 at the time, and her gene had not been upregulated. And so she was in the same home in the same school as my son and all of us, and she didn't get sick. And we were able to check some, objective labs, and all of her inflammatory markers were fine. She had no signs that she had been kind of triggered into this illness. But the all three of the rest of us, we kind of dropped like flies. Again, there's usually a priming event or a trigger that turns this whole process on. And I think we triggered each other, like the stress of one person getting sick and then the rest of the family having to deal with it, learning a little bit about this, the trauma of the medical condition in a family member can trigger another one. And I see that often in moms where they'll come to me and they'll say, I think my 16-year-old daughter might have this. And the more she's caring for her daughter and the more she's not caring for herself, that regulates her own genes, and within a year, she's saying, "I think I have this now." It's like, "Oh, no."
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a very interesting analogy for our practitioners to really lean into. So, like, you're looking at that timeline of what your client dealt with. Like, they had mono, they have an endometriosis diagnosis, they had a rough puberty, they had painful periods, even if they didn't have endometriosis diagnosis. They lived in moldy areas, or they moved a lot, or they started feeling sicker when they went to the dorm in college. Like, and there was a divorce, or and there was some kind of emotional trauma, or there was, medical gaslighting, or a birth injury. Like, I think we have to look at all of these things over time as stacking, and like you said, that genetics at various levels predisposes people. They can tolerate it until their adaptive immune system stops sort of finishing the job of cleaning it up. So the innate immune system is activated. And so it keeps upregulating the chronic inflammatory reactivity, but it doesn't ever get turned off. And so that's why I think it's so important to look over time. Now, here's the challenge that I always feel like people run into. 80% of the buildings in the United States have mycotoxins, and 60% of the homes. And having had this experience, I lived in a home near the beach when I got COVID, and that was one of the like straws that broke the camel's back, if you
Oh,
will.
no. Shoot.
Potentially,
Yeah.
we renovated all of the mold, but doing that like perfectly, and we never even it never even really tested for mold. I was just like, let's just tear it all down and maybe there's something in here, build it back up. And we did. And I never really noticed a difference. And I think even if we like, how do you do that perfectly? Even if you move, you don't know what you're moving into. Like, how do you figure out how to actually clean up the exposure? Or for people that have chronic viral syndromes, your body doesn't actually get rid of the virus. So,
So then you're carrying that around with you, right? The
yeah.
chronic inflammatory response or that post-viral syndrome, it's not so much the environment, but you're taking it with you. Yeah. And it's the same thing with leaky gut or gut issues and the chronic inflammation that can happen from that. There's a lot of crossover. Anything that's an inflammatory response. But I think considering the external environment, if someone is in a chronic inflammatory presentation and we're wondering, is it internal? Could it be external? It's always good to ask, is it external? And there are some tests that I like to use, MSQ-PCR, mold specific quantitative polymerase chain reaction, the same kind of test that we would, use to look for COVID, but looking for DNA of mold bits in our dust. For people with chronic inflammatory response syndrome due to their environment, it doesn't have to be a live mold spore. It can be like that cell wall fragment that is pro-inflammatory. And so looking for any byproducts of even dead mold structures in the home is really helpful. And Dr. Shoemaker actually came up with a scoring system that's based on clinical recovery. And so this is really helpful for people who've been diagnosed with CIRS. We know that we need to do this dust sample, this qPCR mold dust sample. And if we get a score of a 10 or less on the Hertz Me test, then we have a 98.5% chance of recovering in that home as is. So, a lot of research has gone into, well, what are the cleaning solutions that help us get to that score? So, it's all data driven. It's not perfect. And, we're learning more all the time, but at least we have some data to know here's our target, here's the test we're using that is clinically relevant. And okay, it's looking like if we actually clean with soap and water, just as surfactant, that's doing a better job than all of these fancy enzymes and biocides that might be killing the spores or denaturing the mycotoxins. But we know that matter can't be created or destroyed. Like, where do the little crumbs go? The little crumbs, the little cell wall fragments are still in the dust, making us sick. So the surfactant solution of cleaning up, and now this is assuming the remediation is done, like we've actually cut away the water damage or removed the moldy structures, drywall, from our wall or from our home. But then cleaning up the sequelae, cleaning up the invisible aftermath with soap and water and air scrubbers, we wanna remove the debris rather than denature or kill it. That's the way we know that we're gonna get that Hertz Me score of a 10 or less. So in the shoemaker community, there's tons of crossover between environmental, like home specialists, mold inspectors and remediators, and microbiologists who are partnering with the clinicians so that they can come up with these protocols on both the environmental and the medical side.
Okay, great. So you have some resources to help people really actually clean up their homes or choose a home that is tested, test the home periodically to see, what stuff came from your old home that was still a little contaminated. That's just one of those things that I think we have to simplify for people as much as possible because, when you're that sick, you're really overwhelmed to be able to have the capacity to move or renovate your house or whatever. And knowing that it's not actually a very simple process, but if there are like more structured tools for people to use, I think that can take off the pressure because there's this. I always find it's an interesting balance because for me, I was able to recover quite well in the house. Now, we did a lot of work in renovation, and I still don't know for sure if there was, mold was driving it. But I think one of the ways that I was able to do that was to really just do a lot of nervous system regulation. And I feel like there's a really delicate balance. I don't want people to be scared of mold or even chronic viruses because at some level there has to be almost like a relaxation into the reality of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, we live on planet Earth. We can't avoid it completely. So I usually encourage my clients to try to do what they can to clean up their air as much as possible. And if their primary home tests out really high, that's going to require a lot of nervous system work to biohack your way out of. So that's tough. Sometimes we'll create a sanctuary room. Let's see if we can find one room in the house where you feel really good, where we know the air there is better. It's farther away from maybe, the sink that had the water damage. Get some good air purifiers in there, practice your nervous system work, really focus on lifestyle and mindset. And there's a lot that can happen when we do focus on what we have control over. But sometimes I tell people, not necessarily if they're stuck in that position, but if they have some other alternative, like, well, I could move in with my in-laws, like their house is brand new, it's never had water damage, we tested it, had a Hertz Me score of a 4, we could move there. I say, you know what, like maybe if you move there even temporarily, let's give yourself maybe 3 to 6 months of breathing clean air and working on the nervous system stuff there and detoxing. You may get your body to a point where it has that resilience and capacity where you could move back home, maybe just do a little bit of cleaning to your primary home, but you've healed enough to where now you can tolerate it. but it's hard to get to that level of healing if you're still in significant exposure. So it's really individualized, what really is available to a client and what they can do. So we look for those things and we do those things.
I like that idea, all of those ideas. I like that idea of finding maybe some local resources, like you're moving to a family's house or your in law's house, but also just that sanctuary room, places where you feel like where you actually are physiologically safer. That makes it easier, I think, to tap into the nervous system regulation healing piece of it, because it's like, we can't just trick our brains. Once we know there's a certain amount of mold or whatever, it's going to be harder to utilize those tools if it's one of the key triggers. All right. So you go into work with a family. Talk a little bit about your process and how you're implementing this whole process of, essentially, it's just like pediatric PT in the sense that you kind of have to heal the whole family, the environment, the stressors. Take us through it. Yeah, like a case study, if you will.
Yeah, yeah, and I do work 100% virtually now because I know that I'm sensitive to a relapse and I can't go into babies' homes and schools and even clinics. I've chosen to work from home, and I'm not a doctor, and so I collaborate with clinicians who are doing more of the medical side. So I get the majority of my referrals from doctors who have identified that somebody in the family does have CIRS. They meet the diagnostic criteria and they're starting medical treatment. And maybe the doctor has determined they could really use some nervous system work along with the medical. Or they're really overwhelmed by testing their home and figuring out, do we need to move or remediate or clean our stuff or buy air purifiers? Those kinds of things don't require, a medical license, and you're gonna pay a lot of money to work with a doctor on some of the environmental stuff, and I've gone through a lot of training and have worked with a lot of environmental colleagues, to become a specialist in that area too. So I'll get referrals from doctors to coach people on limbic system retraining, on how do we clean up the environment and get things to a statistically safe, even if it's within just one sanctuary room, how do we get you in a safe, breathing safe air so that your medical treatment is going to work? And then I love bringing in the lifestyle and mindset. People usually are more ready for that once they are feeling safe. They feel like they're breathing clean air. Maybe they've done some limbic work to have some inner safety, and then we start to work on diet and sleep and mindset. Sometimes we worked on mindset already in limbic, some of the limbic stuff. There's spiritual stuff, there's trauma. And I'm not a trauma specialist, but for people who have the trauma of the condition, maybe the losses that they experienced, the invalidation that you mentioned, we can process some of those traumas in a safe space. There's a lot of invalidation between family members. And so having a safe space to kind of process that, helping people develop the language to explain their illness. So I kind of come alongside on all of the non-primary medical aspects. And so I'm not wearing my physical therapy hat as much and really doing more functional medicine health coaching. I am a shoemaker proficiency partner, so I'm formally trained in the shoemaker protocol, but I've chosen to use it more in a consulting and coaching role.
Yeah. So, what are some of your favorite limbic system retraining strategies?
Oh, there's so many. So I like to customize this for my clients who need it. There are some who do great with programs, and if that works, by all means, there's so many great programs out. But there are some who just want something a little bit more customized, and so this is kind of when I put on my physical therapy hat a little bit. I'll create a treatment plan for them, and we'll meet more frequently and check in. How is that practice going? Oh, that one made me more anxious. Okay, well, I wonder why. Let's dig into that. Maybe let's just replace that one with something else. Let's try something different. And so we'll kind of come up with a plan or a diet for maybe in the morning, someone's going to wake up and do some tapping. And we've come up with certain affirmations that they're going to use when they go through a tapping routine. Maybe we've come up with a certain practice for every time they feel a fear response or kind of some anxiety, or they feel a symptom coming on and they want to reel it back. we'll come up with a practice. We'll try several and try implementing, see which one works the best for them. But it might be just prolonged exhales, maybe doing 5 to 10 slow breaths where we make the exhales a little longer than the inhales. Something that simple, can be so powerful. For more advanced cases, advanced meaning people I've been working with for a little while and are ready to bring in more kind of expansive or positive emotions to replace some of the fear or anxiety or negative thoughts. We'll work on heart math. So I'm a certified heart math practitioner. And so we actually cultivate favorable emotions and see how long we can hold on to something like joy or beauty, or love. We can picture ourselves at the beach or picture snuggling with our grandkids or whatever it is. Savor that emotion and breathe that in. And we can create an energetic shift and a vibrational frequency shift by using heart math. Sometimes it's top down stuff. There's some people who need to do some reframing, that a lot of their issues come in from thoughts like, that's going to make me sick. I'm going to throw up, or I'm never going to get well. And they have these kind of unsupportive thoughts that are not their allies to their healing. So for some people, we'll identify what those unsupportive thoughts are. What could we replace that with? And then we come up with a practice of reframing. Every time that thought comes in, we say cancel, flip it over. Others have gotten well from this, and I can too. We learn to replace that thought, replace it multiple times throughout the day. And what happens is over time, the new affirmation, the new thought that we've trained our brain to have becomes the dominant one.
Mm,
So those are
yeah.
just some examples, and we bring in some somatic stuff like weighted blankets and some things that worked for my sensory kids as a pediatric PT works great for limbic retraining for people who are in a trauma or a freeze response. So it really depends on whether it's more body-based issues or mind-based issues and how people respond to things. But we come up with a diet and we tweak it over time. And that's usually more of a coaching relationship where we might meet every week or every other week, for several months and really work on empowerment.
I love that. And I think this is just, as a subspecialty, needed more and more because we are living in an increasingly toxic environment. There are new, unfortunately, viral and other pathogens related to climate change that we're going to be continuing to encounter. So I think that this work is so important because our physical bodies are sort of struggling to keep up with all. And I think not just the actual pathogens and environmental toxins, but also the overexposure to, just being on your phone, like bad news and that kind of thing. Like there's a lot of sort of 24/7 input that our immune systems were not adapted, and our nervous system, sort of that connective tissue between the two, were not adapted to handle this much stacking of stress over time. So I think what you're talking about here, this real collaborative relationship between environmental medicine, medical specialists, nutritionists, and physicians and nurse practitioners and PAs and so forth, with the actual implementation. Because even if a person gets a list of, here are the binders to take and here are the supplements to take, they're often very sensitive to those. So they have to move really slowly. I think that it's such a great role for a health coach. And so many of our health coaches are well trained in working with complex cases that I think this is such a nice specialty because that people need a lot of handholding through this process because it's not like a quick and easy solution. It's a process of, you might have to move, you might have to completely renovate your home, you might have to, take extended detoxification protocols for periods of time that don't generally make people immediately feel better, you know?
It's a marathon and not a sprint. We say that often, and it could not be farther from the truth. Yeah.
So, how do you now take care of yourself and your family and any of your clients who are sort of, they're on the other side, they're feeling really well. How do they live now? And one of the things I've really been exploring since, doing this recovery from long COVID is we now really understand that there's no binary of health and wellness. Healthy people can get super sick overnight. Super sick people can have moments of being really well and really connected. This isn't a binary. And so, how do you help people step into the, quote unquote maintenance phase, or because it can be really a big shakeup for someone who was maybe really healthy and then went to college and got really sick all of a sudden in a dorm. It's hard to kind of accept that shift into quote unquote disability or illness.
Yeah, yeah. I'm glad you asked that question, and I think I have a hopeful answer to that because, like I shared, my family has the worst genetics for chronic inflammatory response syndrome, at least the susceptibility to having a relapse. And we've been through this once, and it was 10 years ago. We got well about 8 years ago, and we have been well ever since. And so there's more going on than just that one bad gene that we have. Because if it was all about that one gene, we would get sick every time we go into the grocery store, in the movie theater, in the church, and wherever. And we're not. And so it's more complicated, but in a good way than just looking at, our genetic susceptibility. So I've actually developed a program that I put myself on called salugenics. So you talked about the word pathogen. We're trying to eradicate pathogens and identify pathogens, and there's some importance to that. And for people who've had environmental illnesses, we know to a certain extent, it's not a bad idea to maybe test our home for pathogens like mold or bacteria once a year, just to kind of make sure we're breathing clean air, put in some air purifiers to reduce the pathogens. But then let's focus on the salugens. So a pathogen is something that makes us sick. Salu is wellness, and gen is, genesis. So things that create and sustain wellness. Why don't we just do more of those things? And maybe that's what's balancing out our inevitable exposure to pathogens. And I think it's worked for our family. So we're really digging into the integrative functional medicine, the lifestyle stuff that I think we should all learn as kindergartners that these are our superpowers, and we haven't been shown, I think, to the degree that we deserve, that our mindset, our diet, our movement, our access to nature, our relationships, dealing with our trauma, we kind of take these things for granted, but they are so powerful. They can actually keep us well, or maybe help prevent, more exacerbations of chronic illnesses, or help us be a little bit more resilient, bounce back from something like COVID a little quicker. For our family, it has prevented a CIRS relapse for the last 8 years, despite having the worst genetics. So there's something to lifestyle and diet, or lifestyle and mindset and diet.
I really love that because I think that's exactly how we approach things. It's sort of that upward spiral of healing where you're essentially not aiming to immediately squelch symptoms necessarily, although I do like some of the thought rewiring and all of that, and the nutritional, supplemental, medical impact to heal underlying root causes and suppress symptoms, because it's much easier to do all of this work when you don't feel absolutely terrible. And so, but I think then there turns a corner at some point, or you can even start this fairly early on in your recovery journey. The word of salugen, of like thinking about what can I do today to start building wellness. So if I'm in a flare, instead of distracting with social media, can I do some breath work? Can I just go sit outside? Can I call a friend? Can I make myself a nourishing soup? There are all these options to help people, I guess, take care of themselves and take care of their community. Wear masks if they're sick, or not go out if they're sick, wear masks in general, being mindful of cleaning up damaged water situations or reporting them quickly. I think we can think about this in a very community supportive mindset when we're thinking about protecting ourselves, but everyone else too.
Yeah, so well said. Absolutely agree.
Yeah, I love that. So I think when we're healing from something that's so complex, there's that back of the mindset fear. And yet it sounds like your clients are really responding to, you know what? it is strongly possible over long periods of time to live in health, even with vulnerability, even with some risk factors, as long as I maintain my focus on the things that I can do and I can control to keep my resilience.
Yeah. Yeah, very true. And, minding our environment. I don't want to make it sound like that doesn't matter. Of course it matters. And we are much better homeowners than we ever were before because we now know, we don't want the water pouring out of our gutters the wrong way and landing on our foundation. And I don't think I noticed things like that before. I notice, building maintenance and things like that, and we're, you know, better at maintaining our own and testing our own. We do labs on our bodies. We run the CIRS labs just to see what our inflammatory markers are looking like. We don't want to find ourselves in a full flare before we're like, "Oh, I think it's come back." And so we do monitor, we test our environment, we test our bodies, and we take good care of our homes. It's kinda like if you find out you have an allergy, you kinda know there's this thing that you kinda have to tend to, but we're not living in fear. It's more of an empowered sense of, "Oh, I have this thing, and, I have tools that I know are helpful to protect me." I use the tools, and then I forget about it, and I live like a normal person, and I focus on salugens.
Yeah, that's lovely. So it's really just another form of preventative medicine. It's just like getting your mammogram or something like that, doing your annual blood work. Um, I like that. So, are you still living in the same little farm?
No. No, we did move away from that house, and we didn't know a lot at that time. We made every mistake in the book. We tried to remediate our house ourselves, and, we just did it we made every mistake. It was awful, and we kinda made a mess of it, and, we were living in a place that was very humid, got sideways rain. I think almost any house, is gonna probably be above that safe threshold for healing from CIRS, and when we learned that our kids had the genetics, we just thought, "What if we moved to a place, in the US that has a lower, maybe give us a little better chance of success, and, our kids can make connections and maybe go to college there, and that's their home rather than this part of the country that is a little more challenging." So we moved to Colorado where things dry out. Well, if you spill a glass of water on the carpet, you're not worried about the carpet pad underneath it growing mold the next day. I sop it up, maybe put a dehumidifier on it, and it's dry in an hour. So where we were living before, you would hang a bathing suit out in the garage to dry, and it never dried. It actually turned into a chia pet. So
Yeah.
environment can be helpful. It's not perfect. Water damage can happen anywhere. A dishwasher leak or a toilet overflow, things like that can happen anywhere. So we still need to be vigilant about how we handle, homeowner type things. But weather can be our friend too.
So there definitely are less risky environments, if you will, in those drier locations.
I believe so, because I've lived in 2 very different and I've seen things be very different.
Yeah, really interesting. Thank you so much, Jenny. This has been really educational and really, I think, hopeful, especially for people that are really struggling. Because I find that this is a conversation that can feel very overwhelming without that coaching support. Because it's just like, you see an environmental toxin doctor and they're just like, oh no, everything's a mess, burn down your house. It's just like, and that can, I think, sometimes make it worse if they don't have someone like you to help them navigate the journey. So, if people do want to work with you, where can they find you?
Yeah, well, thanks for asking. You can find me at Simplified Wellness Designs. Jenny at is my email, or you can just go to the website. I also have a Salugenics website for folks who are ready for more of the inner terrain optimization after dealing with the outer terrain. And one other thing, if it's okay that I mention, because your audience might be interested in this, is about a year ago, I launched a course that we're hoping to get CE approval for physical therapists, other allied health professionals, health coaches. It's a 22-hour certification course in CIRS coaching. So for anybody, or CIRS coaching and consulting is what we called it, so that allied health professionals would, you know, would be considered, I guess, a consultant. But for folks who maybe don't wanna be a CIRS specialist, a CIRS medical specialist, but wanna know enough to recognize this in their population, to appreciate some of the evidence behind Dr. Shoemaker's work, and then what are we doing on the structural side, gut health side, nervous system side, environmental, what are those environmental standards and protocols and best practices? It's all laid out in there. So if any of your listeners are wondering, hey, maybe there's a cool CE, program that would help me be more equipped to help people who may have CIRS, it is out there. It is at cirsx.com.
Excellent. Yes, thank you so much for that. I think this is one of those kind of quiet, invisible illnesses that is just not well understood by the vast majority of the healthcare community. So the more people are understanding it, they can spot it in their clients, and they actually have tools and resources and other colleagues to connect with. So thanks for sharing that and creating
Yeah,
it.
absolutely. Yes.
Thanks so much for being here. Thanks so much for your time.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure to speak with you.